Hey everybody, I'm sick and I'm outside, so this recording will probably be a little rough, but you'll have to bear with me. This is chapter 9 of Marx, Contra, Engels by Norman Levine. The chapter is titled The Foundation of Engels' Metaphysics. During his lifetime, Engels passed through 4 phases of development. 1. The years from 1839 until 1848 were the years of formation. Engels became a communist, began Engels' collaboration with Marx, and laid the foundations of his metaphysical materialism. 2. From 1849 until 1878, Engels dedicated himself to military and political affairs. Engels was not only an active participant in the Baden Uprising of 1849, but also made a study of military history, wrote extensively on the military aspects of the Crimean War, the Franco-Austrian War of 1859, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. In addition, Engels wrote a large part of the journalism that appeared in the New York Daily Tribune under Marx's name, for which Marx was paid, and also wrote numerous articles on military subjects for the New American Encyclopedia. From 1850 through 1870, Engels ran the cotton manufacturing firm of Ehrman and Engels, of which his father was a partner, in Manchester, England, and regularly used the financial resources of the business to support Marx and his family during these years of their deepest poverty. 3. The third period of Engels' career, from 1878 until 1890, was the most self-expressive of his life. After acquainting himself with the contemporary state of natural and biological sciences, Engels attempted to apply what he conceived to be the laws of dialectics to the physical universe. In his Anti-Düring, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, but more specifically in The Dialectics of Nature and Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Engels outlined what he thought to be the materialist dialectics of the universe. 4. The last period of Engels' life, from 1890 until his death in 1895, was the apogee of his labors and fame. Engels assumed the position of executor of Marx's work and thought. Engels was the true disciple with the true word, and had become master of the sacred dogma. Continuing to respond to newer cultural trends of the late 19th century Europe, Engels during these last 5 years sought to distinguish Marxism from the encroachments of extreme positivism and idealism. As the Pope of Marxism, Engels basically in his letters to the leaders of the various European socialist parties also sketched the tactical options and the strategic opportunities of the Marxist movement, but ended by hardening his form of Marxism into the rigidities of economic determinism. Generally speaking, when people say the Pope of Marxism, they're referring to Karl Kautsky. It would kind of be the inheritor of Marxism from Engels. The focus of this chapter, however, falls upon the continuities rather than upon the discontinuities of Engels' thought. It is seeking permanence, seeking to isolate those features of Engels' thought pattern that remained constant throughout his life. The criteria applied to Marx is also valid for Engels. There existed in both men a hard and unchanging substructure of thought, an inherent inclination of mind that stamped their thought with its essential and unique qualities, that made it distinctive regardless of the phases that this thought inevitably traversed. It is these essential and unique qualities of mind, the logical presuppositions, that this book is attempting to isolate and categorize in the work of Engels. As part of this exercise in categorization, the role of nature in Engels' thought holds a crucial position. Engels' serious study of nature dated from 1858. Engels distinguished 3 broad periods in the history of natural science: classical, 18th century, and modern. The Greek view of the universe, although fundamentally correct in its conception of the world, failed to explain the details of nature, lacked specific and empirical documentation. Nevertheless, Heraclitus had penetrated to the core of scientific insight, according to Engels, when he described the universe as flux. Aristotle also rejected the attempt to divide nature into fixed, rigid categories. Rather, Aristotle thought of nature in terms of fluid, interpenetrating categories, and thought of motion as the primary force in the universe. To the Greeks, then, nature was everlasting change, and Engels thought their somewhat primitive and naive insights correct in their basic and underlying assumptions. The 18th century view of the world, which had originated in the scientific discoveries of the late 16th century, was totally mechanistic. In the 18th century, the level of development attained by natural sciences had taken these sciences to a mastery of mechanics. Quote, indeed, only the mechanics of solid bodies, end quote. Because of the success of the mechanical model in Newtonian physics, the same model was applied to every branch of science. Chemistry and biology were interpreted mechanistically, and man was what the animal had been to Descartes, a machine. Thus, 18th century materialism was imprisoned within a static view of nature, change and process, the laws of motion, were not part of the conceptual armory of 18th century mechanistic materialism. Empirical investigations in the modern period had revolutionized the understanding of the physical universe. Engels felt that three great discoveries had overturned the static 18th century conception of nature, resurrecting the ancient Greek view of nature as flux. The discovery of the cell had shown that the highest plant and animal organisms developed from the multiplication and differentiation of the simple cell, and also suggested that by means of this same process of multiplication and differentiation, organisms could change their species. Thus, modern biology had proven that there were no fixed and unchangeable species, but rather that species were interconnected, that one species could be formed into another. The discovery of the transformation of energy in physics had shown that all forms of motion and force in the universe were derivable from one form of universal motion. Energy, heat, radiation, electricity, magnetism, and chemical energy were but different forms of one universal force, and thus the whole process of nature was reducible to unceasing transformation of this one universal force into its various manifestations. Lastly, Darwin's theory of evolution had proven that man himself was the end result of a long process of development. The highest form of organic life itself had a history, which originated as a few unicellular germs, but which culminated in time as human consciousness. Because of these three great discoveries, Engels concluded, nature in the 19th century must be interpreted as being itself historical. The contribution that Engels wished to make to the natural sciences was to apply dialectics, which Marx restricted to an explanation of economic and historical events, to the physical universe. Marx had taken the idealist dialectic of Hegel and transformed it into a materialist dialectic. Society, according to Marx, functioned in accordance with dialectical processes. Engels wished to move beyond the realm of human history. Engels wanted to encompass all of nature, wanted to demonstrate that the operational laws of nature itself were dialectical. Engels was seeking a grand system in the style of the older metaphysicians, like Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, and even Hegel himself. Engels was a totalist. He felt he had completed Marx. Although Engels rejected the idealism of Hegel, Engels admired the Hegel who talked of incessant process and movement. Engels recognized that Hegel had left an inescapable impress upon the mind of his century and succeeding centuries. Hegel had shown that process, evolution, and development were the laws of logic, of mind, of human history. The time had come to complete the work begun by Marx, to remove the idealist obfuscation of Hegel, to demythologize him. The time had come to show that process, evolution, and development were also part of the metaphysical being of nature. To this task, Engels dedicated himself. According to Engels, the fundamental dialectical laws of the universe were reducible to three. 1. The law of the transformation of quantity into quality. 2. The law of the interpenetration of opposites. 3. The law of the negation of the negation. Engels noted that all three had been developed by Hegel but, quote, as mere laws of thought, end quote. The first law, quantity into quality, was discussed by Hegel in the first part of his logic, the doctrine of being. The second law, interpenetration of opposites, was discussed by Hegel in part 2 of the logic, the doctrine of essence. The third law, negation of the negation, formed the basis of the whole system. The law of the transformation of quantity into quality was most applicable to the realm of chemistry. All qualitative changes could only occur by the quantitative addition or subtraction of matter or motion. Engels illustrated this point by imagining a non-living body successively cut up into smaller and smaller sections. Eventually, we would penetrate to the molecule, and then even the molecule would be decomposed into its separate atoms. Clearly, the properties of the atom were different from the properties of the molecule. Molecules were qualitatively different from their constituent parts. quantitative addition or subtraction of matter or motion causes qualitative uniqueness. The law of the interpenetration of opposites was best illustrated, however, in the realm of mechanical motion, in the forms of motion of non-living nature. All motion, according to Engels, was related to change of place. Nature was a system of bodies, from large bodies down to atomic particles. These bodies were constantly changing their place, were constantly reacting upon each other, and it was exactly this mutual reaction that constituted motion. All motion, furthermore, consisted of the interplay between attraction and repulsion. Bodies either moved closer to one another, were attracted, or bodies moved further from each other, were repulsed. Thus, mechanical motion assumed two forms, two polar opposites, attraction and repulsion. From the subforms of attraction and repulsion, all the various forms of heat, electricity, and magnetism in the universe were derived. Influenced by Helmholtz, Engels believed that matter was unthinkable without motion. In addition, since matter was an eternal given, it was equally uncreatable as well as indestructible. Engels was also an adherent of the idea of the, quote, conservation of energy, end quote, first established by V.R. Mayer in 1842 and later perfected by Helmholtz. Motion can neither be destroyed nor created, since continued motion was only possible when each individual attraction was compensated by a corresponding repulsion. The sum of all attractions in the universe must be equal to the sum of all repulsions. Therefore, the pool of motion available to the universe must be fixed. Mechanical motion need not only manifest itself as attraction or repulsion. Mechanical motion could be transformed. It could assume other qualities, acquire different properties. In this change, not of the form, but of the quality of mechanical motion, there were again manifest the dialectical laws of the transformation of quantity into quality, of the interpenetration of opposites. Engels was asserting that only one primordial and indestructible substance existed in the universe, motion. Engels thus reduced all materiality in the universe to one phenomenon, motion. This uniforce and unisubstance appeared in different forms, as attraction or repulsion, or in qualitatively different modes, as heat or electricity, as light or magnetism. Underlying the entire dialectical structure of the universe, Engels maintained, was the law of the negation, or, quote, the fundamental law of the construction of the whole system, end quote. Engels understood the law of the negation to mean the absolute certainty that an object, or thought, or condition will turn into its opposite. In the realm of mathematics, Engels saw the law operative in the multiplication of negative A by negative A, which resulted in positive A squared. By negating the negation, we had moved to a higher degree raised to its second power. In the organic world, the law of the negation was manifest by a seed, which under the proper conditions of heat and moisture would germinate into a plant. The plant had negated the seed. Or when a butterfly emerged from an egg, the butterfly had negated that egg. In the realm of history, the realm in which Marx held undisputed mastery, Engels argued that the law of the negation was shown in the transcendence of original, primitive communal property by private property. On a universal basis, men in their primitive stage of development shared property, but this stage had been or was being universally transcended by private property. On the level of pure thought, in philosophy itself, the law of the negation was the principle of motion. The philosophy of the Greeks was naturalistic materialism, and as such was incapable of solving the relationship between thought and matter. Ancient naturalistic materialism, according to Engels, had to be negated. It had been negated, and what emerged was its opposite, idealism. In summary, Engels maintained that the negation was, quote, the law of development of nature, history, and thought, end quote. Engels assumed that he had discovered the energizing principle of the universe. In Aristotelian terms, the prime mover. Life, too, was an expression of the dialectical laws of motion. Life was, quote, the mode of existence of albuminous substances, albuminous substances, end quote. For Engels, to talk about albuminous substances was to talk of the realm of chemistry, to analyze protein substances. Albuminous organisms possessed, as their peculiar quality, the ability to appropriate substances from their environment, assimilate these, use them in their own renewal, and excrete older parts of their bodies. According to Engels, the fundamental condition of existence for albuminous substances was the carrying on of uninterrupted metamorphosis between the organism and the organism's environment. If no such interaction took place, the organism died. Consistent in his application of the dialectical method, Engels therefore saw that life consisted, quote, primarily in the part that at each moment it is itself, and at the same time something else, end quote. Because of the exchange of matter that took place through nutrition and excretion, life itself was process. In man, thought had developed as a function of life, but, argued Engels, before thought could come into existence, a brain had to come into existence. In short, brain was a precondition for mind, or an organ of thought was necessary for thought before thought could take place. Brain, also, for Engels was motion, quote, but the motion of matter is not merely crude mechanical motion, mere change of place. Motion of matter is heat and light, electric and magnetic stress, chemical combination and dissociation, life, and finally, consciousness, end quote. The agency of thought itself, brain, as consciousness, was itself merely a, quote, mode of energy, end quote, a form and reflection of the primary ontological substance, motion. In several books, Engels continuously affirmed the copy theory of knowledge. If brain was motion, then thought itself was simply a picture of the internal world. Quote, we comprehended the concepts in our heads once more materialistically as images, Abbilder, of real things instead of regarding the real things as images of this or that stage of the absolute concept, end quote. Engels maintained that there was absolutely no variance, no difference between our comprehension of the external world and the external world itself. Furthermore, Engels argued that thought itself was dialectical. Men could only think dialectically because men's ideas were merely exact copies of the actual dialectical processes of the external world. Quote, in reality is the reverse. The dialectics of the brain is only the reflection of the forms of motion of the real world, both of nature and of history. End quote. I was just thinking earlier about, I'm not exactly sure because I'm not really equipped to talk about philosophy, dialectics, Hegel, anything about that. But I do know that one thing with Hegel is that, like, I think he had the idea, like, this, like, characterization that Engels had, at least according to this book, that Engels had of, like, Hegel reducing dialectics to a mode of thinking as opposed to a way of as opposed to the way, like, the actual, like, universe, the physical universe is. What was I gonna say? Is that I believe that, like, at least, like, the science of logic, I believe that, like, it's often characterized, I think, by Hegel himself and also by commentators on Hegel as, like, an ontologic. That there's, like, that Hegel's not just merely thinking of, like, laws of thinking, but of also, like, how the universe is actually structured. But you know, what do I know? Anyway, where the hell am I? Engels believed that he had also stood Hegel on his head. True thinking was inherently a dialectical process, but it was so because nature functioned dialectically and our ideas were perfect images of these natural processes. Engels' materialism was thus intended to be a total metaphysical system. It was intended to describe and account for existence from its origins in motion, to its organic forms of albuminous substance, to its final expression as idea. It was a cold, unremitting, and remorseless system. Men had little impact on fashioning the course of development of history and nature. Rather than being the subject of history, men were basically the passive objects of unrelenting external forces. Causation originated and flowed from the physical. The same laws that govern the physical universe also govern the social universe. Life existed in this solar system because the energy forces were sufficient to maintain it. But it was probable that this solar system would burn out, and life too on this solar system would burn out. A different solar system would have sufficient energy resources to sustain life, and life would spring up there. Engels was talking about continuous creation, but a continuous creation that was totally governed by the physical laws of motion. Engels' system was an eternal cycle of death and creation, but it was a cycle in which human death and rebirth were solely dependent upon the blind mechanics of nature. Engels' philosophy of nature was a materialist monism. His basic assertion can be reduced to the claim that everything that was matter and its motion. Furthermore, Engels' metaphysical materialism was mechanistic. He conceived of the universe as a vast machine, operating directly in terms of quantitative shifts of matter and motion. I have trouble saying quantitative. I have trouble saying that word for some reason, at least today, maybe in general. Mechanistic models were also deterministic models, and Engels' account of that functioning in quantities of matter and motion led him to embrace a cosmological determinism. The view of the natural universe that had come to fruition in Engels' mind after 1858 had existed in embryo in the mind of the young Engels. There were present in Engels' mind throughout his lifetime certain predispositions of thought and attitude that gave shape, that served as the ground of his more concrete and specific meditations. In short, given Engels' mental predispositions as a young man, the intellectual assumptions that had taken root in his mind before he met Marx, it was predictable that his mature view of nature would take the shape that it did in his mature years. Engels began his life as a pietist. After his conversion to Hegelianism, the God of his youth was transformed into the pantheism of reason. After 1858, matter and motion were to take the place of reason. Engels was a man in search of an absolute. He was seeking ontology. In successive stages, Engels was to find the metaphysical origin of the universe in God, reason, and matter. His reductivist tendency of thought was manifested when he approached the problem of history, in the naive positivism of his view of social change. His simplistic acceptance of mechanistic determinism in relation to nature was to become a simplistic acceptance of economic determinism in relation to history. The preceding paragraphs described and categorized Engels' philosophy of nature. That philosophy, as we have seen, was predicated upon the attempt to take the dialectic from its Hegelian format and make matter itself behave dialectically. At this point, it would be extremely productive to compare Hegel and Engels in terms of their views of nature and their views of dialectics. Several enlightening results will emerge from this comparison. First, it will be interesting to see how well Engels understood Hegel, that is, to test Engels' philosophic and analytical acuity. Second, we will see whether there was any logical justification, to see whether there was any sense left to the idea of dialectics when nature itself was interpreted dialectically. Third, after determining Engels' understanding of Hegel, we will then compare Engels to Marx in terms of their understanding of Hegel. In this way, we will examine not only their respective insights into Hegel, but also what each took from Hegel, and thus again expose their basic and distinctive aptitudes and intellectual predispositions. Hegel defined nature, quote, as the idea in the form of otherness, end quote. Nature was the notion of nature in its external form. The specific character of nature was externality. Nature could not exist at all if it did not exist as externality. Drawing upon Christian theology, Hegel allegorically alluded to nature as the, quote, Son of God, end quote. Just as nature stood outside of God, just as Christ existed as otherness, nature stood outside of spirit, existed as contradiction. Christ must be resurrected. Where am I? Must unite with God, and in parallel fashion, Hegel maintained, nature must reunite with spirit. Nature as a strange spirit must become spirit again. It did this by sublating itself by its contradiction, by transcending itself as otherness. Externality, however, did not act. Nature itself did not rejoin spirit. Rather, spirit used nature to become absolute freedom. Spirit overcame externality. Spirit in transcending otherness became conscious of itself as absolute freedom. Spirit was the motivating force. Nature was passive. In fact, the various grades of nature, the separate hierarchies of nature, were not brought into being through any emergent quality of nature itself. For Hegel, nature did not evolve, did not transform nature's self, but rather it was spirit that placed nature in nature's distinctive grades. Spirit pulled nature into unity with itself, but nature gave spirit the opportunity to become absolute freedom, but just existing as pure externality and as estrangement. Hegel conceived of nature as a system of three stages: mechanics, physics, and organics. One stage arose necessarily from the previous stage, but this did not mean that one stage generated naturally out of the other. Externality would not generate from itself a different form of externality. Metamorphosis pertained only to spirit. That is, only spirit had the power to produce development of generation. Mechanics was the realm of, quote, infinite separatedness, end quote, quote, infinite separatedness, end quote, quote, of asunderness, end quote, or of, quote, mutual outsideness, end quote. There was no unity in this realm, no formal connectedness, but this was the ideal state of matter, that is, disjointedness. Unity must be imposed from the outside. The realm of physics was the realm of, quote, natural individuality, end quote. Here, nature was posited as a determinate form. Physics was hung within itself in its external form. True subjectivity belonged to organics. The organic entity, regardless of differences of form, had found a unity in itself. It was for itself. It was therefore subjectivity. Clearly, Hegel and Engels had two entirely different conceptions of the structure of nature. Hegel thought in terms of three distinct stages of hierarchy. Engels, on the other hand, as a mechanistic materialist, thought of nature as a continuum, without separate hierarchies. Beginning with motion, Engels believed that quantitative changes of motion could produce qualitative changes, and thus all nature, from mechanics to conscious life, were a mere serial extension of this primitive ontological substance. Engels' perversion of Hegel's philosophy of nature stemmed from the fact that Engels completely disregarded Hegel's own wishes. That is, he interpreted Hegel in a way that Hegel himself specifically did not want to be interpreted. For instance, Hegel directly asserted that it was impossible to account for qualitative change in terms of quantitative increase or decrease. Hegel directly refuted the idea of Engels that quantitative change only made for qualitative change in the organic world. It does not, Hegel argued, because to do so would be to surrender the idea of identity. It would be impossible to distinguish difference, to isolate and separate one thing from another. Thus, the very law that Engels claimed to be one of three general laws of the universe, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, which Engels said was developed by Hegel in the doctrine of being of the logic, was, in fact, rejected by Hegel in terms of the organic world as inadequate to properly explain qualitative change. Furthermore, Hegel is convinced that qualitative change could only be brought about by idea or spirit. Idea displayed idea's self in the finitude of each grade, but it was idea, through the dialectic, that broke through the limitations of each grade to move to a higher stage. For Hegel, quality was always a function of idea. Therefore, real metamorphosis could only be understood as a product or result of idea. Furthermore, Hegel, in specific and concrete terms, also categorically rejected Engels' idea of nature as a continuum, as a serial extension of matter and motion. It is necessary at this point to extract a rather long passage from Hegel's philosophy of nature. Quote, the two forms under which the serial progression of nature is conceived are evolution and emanation. The way of evolution, which starts from the imperfect and formless, is as follows. At first there was the liquid elements and aqueous forms of life, and from the water there evolved plants, polyps, mollusks, and finally fishes. Then from the fishes were evolved the land animals, and finally from the land animals came man. This gradual alteration is called an explanation and understanding. It is a conception which comes from the philosophy of nature, and it still flourishes. But though this quantitative difference is of all theories the easiest to understand, it does not really explain anything at all. The way of emanation is peculiar to the Oriental world. It involves a series of degradations of being, starting from the perfect being, the absolute totality, God. Emanation thus ends with the absence of all form. Both ways are one-sided and superficial, and postulate an indeterminate goal, end quote. The preceding paragraph sounds like a short summary of Engels' whole philosophy of nature. In fact, Hegel almost appeared to be offering a parody of the model of explanation based upon evolution or serial extension. Concretely, however, Hegel rejected all serial explanation because it blurred difference, and because it blurred difference, it also blurred identity. All individuality, all determinate forms, tend to be lost in amorphous primal substance. Thus, the end result of serial explanation, even though it was the easiest to understand, was that, quote, it does not really explain anything at all, end quote. Not only was the method of explanation used by Engels a method specifically rejected by Hegel himself, But Engels also demonstrated a fundamental inability to comprehend the basic principles of Hegel's more inclusive system. Engels completely distorted this system. In fact, Engels destroyed it. Motion, for Engels, became the energizing principle of the universe. Hegel would have branded such an idea pure nonsense. Only spirit had the power of motivation, according to Hegel. Spirit was motion because only spirit desired freedom. Spirit wished to be self-determining, wished to be self-dependent, and therefore it embarked upon a journey to conquer that self-determination. It was impossible, according to Hegel, to ascribe the desire for freedom to motion, and therefore impossible to ascribe to motion the power to produce quality. In short, Engels assigned to motion the potential that Hegel categorically and exclusively assigned to spirit. Engels also did not understand what Hegel meant by subjectivity. The subjective for Hegel is purposeful activity. The subjective was activity for itself. It was self-relation and self-containment. Therefore, subject could only be spirit, because only spirit was capable of self-determination. For Hegel, the subjective was that which moved towards self-determination. In his philosophy of nature, Engels made matter subject. In so doing, he completely destroyed any meaning that Hegel had assigned to the notion of subjectivity. Matter could not indulge in purposive activity. Matter could not be self-determinate, nor could it be self-dependent and for itself. By distorting Hegel, by making matter subject, Engels in addition lost all contact with the Hegelian ideas of individuality, freedom, self-objectification, and praxis. The subject, the individual, acted for Hegel, while for Engels only nature was subject, therefore only nature acted. The fact that Engels did not understand the idea of the subjective in Hegel meant that he did not understand what Hegel meant by the dialectic. When Engels referred to nature as functioning by dialectical laws, he absolutely misconstrued what Hegel meant by the dialectic, and therefore Engels used the terms in a meaningless fashion. 1 second. My neighbor's cutting his lawn. I want to go to the side of the house that's not where he is. There we are. Oh, it's nice over here. Where the hell am I? When Engels referred to nature as functioning by dialectical laws, Engels absolutely misconstrued what Hegel meant by the dialectic, and therefore Engels used the term in a meaningless fashion. Engels used the term dialectic as being synonymous with process, with change. The central model with which Engels dealt was the image of two molecules colliding and thus producing heat or electricity. From two solid objects, a form of energy was produced. Solidness had been changed into non-solidness. When Engels said dialectics, he meant process. Engels was a Heraclitean. What Hegel meant by dialectic was something fundamentally different. Quote, "It, bracket, spirit, end bracket, is the inner being of the world, that which essentially is, and is per se. Spirit assumes objective, determinate form, and enters into relation with spirit self. Spirit is externality, bracket, otherness, end bracket, and exists for self. Yet, in the determination, and in its otherness, it is still one with itself. It is self-contained and self-complete, in itself and for itself at once. This self-containedness, however, is first something known by us. It is implicit in its nature. It is substance spiritual. It has become self-contained for itself, on its own account. It must be knowledge of spirit. It must be consciousness of itself as spirit. This means it must be presented to itself as an object, but at the same time straightway annul and transcend the subjective form. It must be its own object in which it finds itself reflected." End quote. For Hegel, the dialectical process was not itself synonymous with motion. Development movement was a result, a consequence of this dialectical process, but was not the process itself. According to Hegel, development was a result of certain structures of existence. There were certain formal contents of existence, certain given determinations within reality, which clashed and were in opposition. The consequence of this clash, the result of this collision, was motion. Inherent in the Hegelian notion of dialectic was the idea of negativity, or opposition. The basic structure of existence, for Hegel, counterposed a subject, spirit, to negativity, object or materiality. In order for spirit, for individuality, to become free to become self-determining, it must be confronted with otherness. Only in this way could subject transcend otherness, externality, and acquire greater self-determination and self-relatedness. Hegel's world was a world of struggle, of combat, of tragedy. Two entities were indispensable: a subject seeking to function solely in terms of its own desires, and the negative, the not-self, which hindered the subject's attainment of absolute self-relatedness. A resolution of this duality was required. This resolution was motion. That is, the opposition of self and negation must be transcended. This transcendence, this cancelling, took the form of development, of change. Hegel's dialectic required concrete determinations, subject and negativity. It was inherently a dualistic system, composed of determinate oppositions. It also required activity. It required that subject have a purpose, freedom. The notion of praxis was central to the Hegelian dialectic. The subject must desire to engage in combat, must desire to cancel the negative, must find its purpose in absolute self-relatedness. Otherwise the system would remain static and have no meaning. Engels' use of the term dialectic thus had little meaning, and bore not the slightest resemblance to the Hegelian notion. Engels did not think in terms of opposition, of negativity. There was no drama, no resolution of inherent conflict. Hegel pitted two concrete determinations against each other, individuality and the objective. For Engels, there was emanation. There was the continuity of motion and process. For Engels, there was no conflict, no resolution of that conflict on a higher and qualitatively different stage, but rather a stream of notion, and the different forms that motion could assume. Marx bore a much closer relationship to Hegel than did Engels. Marx revised Hegel, whereas Engels completely distorted Hegel. The uniqueness of the Marxian system derived in large measure from what it retained of Hegel. The uniqueness of Engels' thought arises in part from what it rejected and lost of Hegel. Marx turned the Hegelian dialectic on its head, but kept its basic structure. The notion of subjectivity was retained by Marx. A conscious, active, modifying agent existed in the Hegelian dialectic. For Hegel, that agent was spirit. For Marx, the agent was social man as he modified his natural environment to produce his substance. Both spirit and social man were active, purposeful, and causal agents. The difference was that the Hegelian spirit was non-material, while social man for Marx was a natural creature. Marx also retained the Hegelian notion of praxis. For both, man was a being who labored, who was change enduring and change creating. Man was the subject of history, the causal agent. For Marx, man interpenetrated with nature, fashioned from its brute materiality objects necessary for his existence. The Marxian man humanized nature, molded and controlled nature in accordance with his own needs. For Hegel, man was a being who brought forth idea, and in so doing, altered the conceptual world in which he lived. Again, Hegel thought in non-material terms, and Marx in material terms. But essential to both their systems was the idea of man as praxis, as conscious, purposive activity. Marx was also true to the Hegelian notion of negativity, or externality. For both, externality was passive. It could be acted upon, but could itself not be an active force. For Hegel, the external as opposition was transcended by idea, was incorporated by idea, was refashioned by idea, and idea's march to its own freedom. For Marx, negativity was overcome when man in the act of praxis created tools of sustenance or shelter. Indeed, the Marx of the Grundrisse and Capital was far more Hegelian than the Marx of the Paris manuscripts. In the early writings, Marx attempted to escape the deadening idealism of Hegel, was predominantly working in the Feuerbachian mold. But when he came to explain the inner dynamics of capitalist society in 1857, Marx returned to the structure of Hegelian logic. The language of the Grundrisse was thickly and self-consciously Hegelian. In fact, Marx attempted to explain the working of capitalist society, and of all societies according to the logical principles contained in the second volume of Hegel's Logic. When Marx wrote Capital, the Hegelian structure was still there, but the density of the Hegelian terminology had been replaced by statistical and mathematical data. A rebaptized Hegelian, Marx sought to explain capitalism in terms of the Hegelian notions of inherent contradiction, moment, determination, negation, and totality in essential relationships. Marx and Engels thus had completely dissimilar views of Hegel. Marx perpetuated the Hegelian notions of subjectivity, human praxis, and conscious purposeful activity. Engels, on the other hand, made nature the subject, that is, imparted to externality all activity, all causality in the universe. Engels overlooked the role of human praxis, rather seeing a quantitative alteration of matter and motion that which produced change in the universe. Lastly, Engels found no place for purposeful activity, for consciousness, in his interpretation of Hegel. Rather, for Engels, consciousness itself was a product of motion, and it was only due to the activity of matter that direction or movement was imparted to the universe. Marx and Engels had openly conflicting views of Hegel and the universe. Marx's universe was anthropocentric. Engels' universe was cosmocentric. Marx was a left-wing Hegelian who made man the center of his world, the laboring Prometheus. Engels was a right-wing Hegelian who made man the victim of universal motion, who saw in man something that did not act, but rather who was acted upon and shaped by forces totally external to him and totally beyond his control. Engels' proclivity to right-wing Hegelianism has already been noted. As a young man, when Engels first came across Hegel, Engels interpreted Hegel as saying that the only thing that moved in the universe was absolute spirit. Everything else in the universe, including man, was a mere appendage to absolute spirit. As a mature man, Engels was to say, in perfect consistency with his youthful frame of mind, that everything that moved in the universe, that which brought forth particulars in life, was matter in motion. Everything else, including man, was merely reflexes, reactions of this absolute motion. The differences that divided Marx and Engels in their interpretation of Hegel also divided Marx and Engels in their interpretation of nature. In making the laws of nature themselves dialectical, Engels attempted something that Marx himself never attempted. For Marx, the dialectic was not in nature itself, but in the interaction between man and nature. The dialectical process for Marx was the motion of form and content. Species being was the content for which nature was the form. Engelsism totally erased the subjectivist element. For Engels, the being of nature was dialectical, and all other existence proceeded from these laws. The central idea that distinguished the Marxian from the Engelsian interpretation of nature was the notion of praxis. Whereas Marx spoke of a pre-given natural and social environment in which men coexisted and interpenetrated with the physical environment, Engels described a macrocosmic determinism in which thought was merely the epiphenomenon of physical forces. Marx referred to humanistic and dialectical naturalism, the belief that man modified the inorganic world, while Engels referred to a metaphysical monism, the belief that organic and inorganic existence were both reducible to a universal monosubstance. The Marxian vision was always a man who acted, while the Engelsian vision was a cosmological. The Marxian vision was always on man who acted, while the Engelsian vision was on cosmological determinism. Marx was an immanentist. Engels was an emanationist. Epistemologically, also, wide differences existed between Marx and Engels. Characteristically, Engels approached the problem of knowledge in a basically simplistic fashion. Engels drew an absolute distinction between mind and matter. Those who asserted the primacy of matter were, according to Engels, materialistic. Those who asserted the primacy of mind or spirit were idealists. Engels then created an absolutely polarized epistemological world. Consciousness and matter were dichotomous entities. There was no mixture, no interpenetration, no fusion of these two forces. In Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Engels defined materialism as the belief that matter was not mind, but rather mind the product of matter. It is not surprising, then, that Engels expounded a, quote, copy theory, end quote, of the truth. Our ideas were mere replicas of external objects. Mind was essentially photographic film upon which the external world imprinted pictures of the external world self. Such an interpretation of knowledge was a direct consequence of the model from which Engels started. If man and nature were distinctive, the only way to obtain ideas of the external world was to have the external world imprint them onto man's consciousness. Epistemologically, Marx came from an entirely different tradition from Engels. Again, Marx was a Hegelian. In short, Marx, like Hegel, tried to overcome the absolute separation of subject from object. Hegel transcended the Kantian and Lockean position that consciousness and thing in itself were totally divorced. Knowledge for Marx was something created or attained through the practico-critical activity of man. Species being meant to be in a state of constant interchange between oneself and one's environment. species being meant to interpenetrate with the world, to modify the world, to fuse with the world, and therefore to humanize the world. In effect, Engels did away with philosophy. Engels replaced philosophy with positive science. Because mind was simply a mirror image of the dialectical process of the external world, mind was a passive agent. What could affect the external world was not practical critical activity, but rather empirical data. Knowledge of how the world functioned was more important than man's own approach to the world. Positive science took the place of critical consciousness. This discussion of Engels' philosophy of nature has revealed weakness in his intellectual armory. Engels did not have an acute, analytic, precise mind. As a young man and a student, Engels never received formal academic training in philosophy or any other discipline. Engels is not a trained scholar. Engels' lack of ability to apply rigid and exacting standards of judgment was clearly demonstrated in Engels' visions of the physical universe. Engels misunderstood Hegel. Engels assumed he was applying the Hegelian dialectic to nature when in fact he was completely destroying that dialectic. Such misconceptions, such gross errors of interpretation reveal a mind not trained to rigors of philosophic thought, a mind unable to arrive at precise definitions, a mind unable to see distinctions. Engels had a tendency to see the similarity of things rather than their distinctiveness. He blurred difference, and thus tended to confuse ideas. Engels' talent lay in the field of narrative and description. Engels' writings on nature were not an analysis or critical examination of recent scientific discoveries, but rather an explication of these discoveries. Engels was a talented and sophisticated popularizer who, because of a lucid and clear style, could express complex ideas in a straightforward and comprehensible fashion. However, it was because of his talent for description, because of his talent for narrative, that Engels confused and misinterpreted more speculative ideas. Engels believed in similarity rather than in surgery. Engels tended to synthesize rather than to separate. Thus, Engels was led into inexact formulation, hazy definition, and lack of precise categorization. Within his time, to his contemporaries, Engels had performed a valuable service for the socialist movement. The late 19th century was a period of rapid scientific advancement, and Engels assumed the responsibility as well as the mission of offering a left interpretation of the burgeoning empirical data. Here again, Engels' gift for popularization for description proved of value to him. He summarized and evaluated. From a left perspective, he made available to the socialist movement the most important scientific discoveries of the 19th century. Engels thus buttressed socialist ideology. Engels imparted to the socialism of his day the theoretical and conceptual tools with which to interpret the plethora of scientific experimentation. On the one hand, Engels had to respond to revival of idealism, Eugener Düring. For Eugener Düring, for example, this threat from the right was the lesser of two evils. There was enough scientific data to destroy any notions of spirit, of eternal verities. The force theory of Düring, even Treitschke, could be negated by the class interpretation of society. I think Treitschke was like one of the leading figures of leading thinkers of political anti-Semitism in 19th century Germany. Late 19th century Germany, if you're curious. I'm familiar with that name because I took a Nazi Germany class, and he's one of the primary sources we had to read. The assigning of an independent and autonomous existence to the state in the fashion of Burckhardt could be dispelled through economic analysis. Conversely, Engels had to respond to positivism. Engels' grasp of the science of his day was sound. Engels abandoned the corpuscular theory of matter. Engels saw electromagnetic fields, the basic building blocks of the universe. Engels made Darwinism an accepted tenet of socialist philosophy. In these respects, Engels was ahead of his time. However, although Engels was aware of the rigidities of positivist thought, Engels ultimately failed to avoid those rigidities. In his letters of the 1890s to Conrad Schmidt and J. Bloch, Engels attempted to avoid the positivist simplification of the historical process. He drew attention to the role of ideas in history. He drew attention to the importance of social as distinct from economic forces in history. However, the inclusion of ideas and of the social amplified the picture but did not decide it. Indeed, Engels took note of the ideational but always concluded that in the last analysis economic and technological causality was primary. The sufficient conditions were always economic. The necessary conditions were both economic and ideational. Thus, although he made room for value, something other, a more short-sighted positivist would not have done, Engels nevertheless ended as a positivist himself. In the same way that Engels misinterpreted Hegel, so he misinterpreted Marx. His inability to exactly categorize, to make distinctions, led him to assume that his ideas and Marx's ideas ran parallel to each other. Engels' penchant to seek out similarity led Engels to assume that he and Marx spoke in one voice. It is easy to understand why Engels never disclaimed or challenged any of Marx's ideas or writings. The real problem is to determine why Marx never disclaimed any of Engels' ideas, even when Engels misinterpreted his friend, as he had misinterpreted Hegel and also Feuerbach. So that's the end of the chapter. I'm going to read the footnotes, see if there's anything there. Marx and Engels, selected correspondence. Engels anti-Dühring, Engels dialectics of nature, Engels Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy, Engels socialism, utopian and scientific and utopian, Z.A. Jordan, the evolution of dialectical materialism, G.W.F. Hegel, the philosophy of mind, Hegel, phenomenology of mind. There's a new footnote. On the relationship between Marx and Hegel, see the following works. Günther Hillmann, Hegel und Marx, 1970. Paul Kagi, Genesis des historischen Materialismus, 1965. Gottfried Stieler, Dialektik und Praxis, 1960. A book that does not concentrate on the epistemological relationship between Marx and Hegel, but which nevertheless offers illuminating insights into their connectedness, is Jean Hippolyte's Studies on Marx and Hegel. End of that footnote. Refer to Chapter 8 for the fuller analysis of Engels' right-wing Hegelianism. That's already been recorded. It's not up on the channel, but it's been recorded, so it might be up on the channel. I plan on releasing these in chronological order, but and another footnote says, there's a growing body of work that focuses upon the epistemological problem in Marxism. The more outstanding are Ernst Bloch, Uwe Marx from 1968, Nicholas Lobkowicz, Theory and Practice, 1967, Karl Löwit, Die Hegelische Linke, which I guess is the left Hegelians, or the Hegelian left, Alfred Schmidt, Beiträge zur marxistischen Erkenntnistheorie, and Nathan Rothenstreich, Basic Problems of Marxist Philosophy, 1965. I thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.